The afternoon sun streamed through the kitchen windows, casting warm patches of light across the tile floor. It was supposed to be just another ordinary Tuesday. A young boy was sitting at the kitchen counter, his math homework spread out before him, occasionally glancing up at his mom, who was preparing a light snack for them both. His mother was 8 months pregnant, and lately she'd been taking more breaks to rest, her hand often resting protectively over her growing belly. The boy loved watching his mom cook. There was something magical about the way she could turn simple ingredients into delicious meals. But today, something felt different. His mom's movements seemed slower and more hesitant. She paused more often than usual, leaning against the counter for support. "Are you okay?" he asked, noticing how she'd stopped stirring the bowl of fresh fruit she was preparing. His mother tried to smile, but he could see the strain on her face. "I'm just a bit tired, sweetheart," she said, but her voice sounded different, strained and breathy. She took another step toward the refrigerator, then suddenly stopped. The bowl she was holding slipped from her hands, scattering fruit across the floor. Her face had gone completely pale. "Mom?" The boy slid off his chair, his forgotten pencil rolling off the counter. Something was very wrong. His mother's hands were trembling as she gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, her knuckles turning white. Then, without warning, her knees buckled. Time seemed to slow down as he watched his mother sink to the floor. She tried to catch herself, but her movements were uncoordinated, clumsy. She managed to slide down rather than fall completely, but the sight of his strong, capable mother crumpled on the kitchen floor made his heart race with fear. "Baby," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I need you to be brave right now." She was breathing in short, sharp gasps, one hand pressed against her stomach. "Call 911. Remember how we practiced." The boy's hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped his mother's phone, which had fallen from her pocket when she collapsed. They had indeed practiced emergency calls. His mother had always believed in being prepared. She'd make him memorize their address, taught him to speak clearly, and reminded him to stay calm in emergencies. But all those practice sessions felt far away now as panic threatened to overwhelm him. He forced himself to take a deep breath, just like his mother had taught him. His small fingers pressed the 3 numbers that could save his mom's life, 911. Each beep of the keypad seemed to echo in the suddenly silent kitchen, broken only by his mother's labored breathing. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Each ring felt like an eternity as he watched his mother struggle to stay conscious, her face contorted in pain. Her eyes were closed now, but her lips were moving silently, as if in prayer. The sight of her, usually so strong and full of life, lie helpless on the floor made his throat tight with fear. Finally, a voice answered on the other end of the line. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's tone was flat, almost bored, so different from the urgent situation unfolding in front of him. The boy summoned every bit of courage he had. His mother had always told him that in an emergency, every second counted. He needed to be clear, he needed to be brave, he needed to get help, not just for his mom, but for his unborn sibling too. Little did he know, this call would set in motion a chain of events that would change not just his family's life, but the entire emergency response system in their community. Looking at his mother's pale face, he took another deep breath and began to speak, his young voice steady despite his racing heart. This was the moment where being brave wasn't just about feeling scared and doing something anyway. It was about being the only person who could help the people he loved most in the world. 911, what's your emergency? The operator repeated, her voice carrying an edge of impatience that made the boy's stomach tighten. He could hear keyboard clicks in the background, but something about the operator's tone felt wrong. "Please," he said, his voice clear despite his fear, "my mom collapsed in our kitchen. She's pregnant and she's having trouble breathing." He glanced at his mother, who was still conscious but barely able to keep her eyes open. Her face had taken on a grayish tinge that scared him more than anything else. The operator's sigh crackled through the phone. "Listen, kid, we've had a lot of prank calls lately. Do you know what happens to people who make fake emergency calls?" The boy's heart dropped to his stomach. This couldn't be happening. He'd done everything right, speaking clearly, giving information just like his mom had taught him. "No, please, this isn't a prank. My mom really needs help." His voice cracked with desperation as he watched his mother's head loll to one side. I can hear you trying not to laugh, the operator said coldly. This line is for real emergencies only. If you call again to play games, we'll have to report this to the authorities. The line went dead before he could protest further. The boy stared at the phone in disbelief, hot tears welling up in his eyes. His mother had always told him that 911 operators were there to help, that they were the good guys. But this one hadn't even let him finish explaining. He looked at his mom, who was now struggling to stay awake, her breathing becoming more labored with each passing minute. A memory flashed through his mind, his mother talking about their neighbor during dinner last week. Mrs. K from next door, she'd said, was telling me about her nursing days. 40 years of helping people, can you imagine? At the time, he'd been more interested in his spaghetti than the conversation, but now, he squeezed his mother's hand. Mom, I'm going to get help. I promise. Just hold on. Her fingers tightened weakly around his, and he took that as a sign she understood. Running to the front door, he nearly tripped over his own feet in his rush. The afternoon sun momentarily blinded him as he burst outside, but he didn't slow down. Their neighbor's house was only 30 feet away, but it felt like miles as he sprinted across their connected lawns. His sneakers pounded against the concrete of her walkway as he reached her door. He pressed the doorbell over and over, then started knocking when no one immediately answered. Please be home, he whispered to himself, his heart thundering in his chest. After what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds, the door opened. Their neighbor stood there in her gardening clothes, soil still on her gloves. Her friendly smile dropped when she saw his tear-streaked face. My mom, he gasped, pointing frantically toward his house. She collapsed. She's pregnant. The operator wouldn't help. The words tumbled out in a rush. The elderly woman's expression changed instantly, years of emergency room experience kicking in. She didn't waste time with questions, just grabbed a small medical bag from a shelf near her door and followed him back to his house. Her movements were quick and purposeful, belying her age. They'd found his mother still on the kitchen floor, her breathing now so shallow it was barely visible. The neighbor knelt beside her, professional calm masking the concern in her eyes as she checked his mother's pulse and blood pressure with tools from her bag. Call 911 again, she ordered, her voice firm but kind. Tell them a retired emergency room nurse is requesting immediate assistance for a pregnant woman with suspected preeclampsia. When he hesitated, remembering the previous call, she added gently, It's okay, sweetie. I'll be right here with you. We'll get your mom the help she needs. His hands were steadier this time as he dialed, drawing strength from the calm, capable presence beside him. As the phone rang, he watched the neighbor tending to his mother with practiced movements, speaking to her in soft, reassuring tones. A different voice answered this time, warmer, more alert. The boy took a deep breath and began again, this time with the neighbor nodding encouragingly as he relayed the information. The operator asked focused, relevant questions, and he could hear her dispatching an ambulance even as she kept him on the line. Help is on the way, the operator assured him. You're doing a great job. Can you tell me if your mom is still conscious? For the first time since this nightmare began, he felt a tiny spark of hope. This was how it was supposed to work. This was what his mother had prepared him for. As he answered the operator's questions, he could already hear sirens in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. His neighbor squeezed his shoulder with her free hand, her eyes warm with approval. You're a brave young man, she said quietly. Your mom's going to be so proud of you. The sound of the approaching sirens grew louder, and red lights began to flash through the kitchen windows. Help was finally coming, but the boy couldn't help wondering why it had taken 2 tries to get it. As he watched the paramedics rush up their front walk, he made a silent promise to himself and his mother he would make sure no other kid ever had to go through what he just did when calling for help. The paramedics moved with swift efficiency through the kitchen door, their equipment rattling softly as they rushed to help. The boy watched from beside his neighbor as they knelt next to his mother, their voices calm but urgent as they assessed her condition. Their presence filled the kitchen with purposeful energy, so different from the helpless fear of just minutes before. Tell us exactly what happened, one paramedic asked while checking his mother's vitals. The boy started to speak, but his neighbor gently interrupted. I'm a retired ER nurse, she said, her hand still steady on the boy's shoulder. She's showing classic signs of severe preeclampsia, elevated blood pressure, confusion, and distress. But there's something else you need to know. She explained about the first 911 call and how it had been dismissed. The paramedics exchanged concerned glances as they worked, one of them speaking rapidly into a radio to update the hospital. "We'll need to document that," the lead paramedic said quietly. "But right now, let's focus on Mom and baby." They moved his mother onto a stretcher with careful precision. The boy had never seen his mother look so vulnerable. Her face was partially covered by an oxygen mask, and various monitors were already attached to her body, beeping steadily. One of the paramedics noticed his frightened expression. "Hey, buddy," she said softly, pausing in her work. "You did everything right, you know that. You got help for your mom when she needed it most. That makes you the hero of this story." The boy didn't feel like a hero. Heroes didn't cry, did they? But tears were streaming down his face as he watched them prepare to move his mother. His neighbor pulled him close in a gentle hug. "I'll go with them in the ambulance," she said, her kind eyes meeting his. "Your mom shouldn't be alone, and we need to call your dad. Do you know how to reach him?" The boy nodded, pulling his mom's phone from his pocket. His dad was at a construction site today, working on a big project downtown. His hands trembled as he found the contact labeled Dad and pressed call. The phone rang several times before his father's cheerful voice answered. "Hey, honey, everything okay?" The boy tried to speak, but suddenly found himself choking on tears. The neighbor gently took the phone from his shaking hands. "Hello, this is Mrs. K from next door," she said calmly. "Your wife's being taken to City Hospital with pregnancy complications. She's stable but needs immediate care. Your son is here with me. He's been incredibly brave." There was a brief silence, then the sound of his father's voice, tight with worry but controlled. The neighbor listened, then covered the phone. "Your dad's going to call your aunt to come stay with you while he meets us at the hospital. Is that okay?" The boy nodded, watching as the paramedics carefully maneuvered the stretcher through the kitchen door. Everything was happening so fast, yet time seemed to be moving in slow motion. The neighbor handed him back the phone, and his father's voice came through, stronger now. "Son, I'm so proud of you," his dad said, the sound of rushing wind in the background suggesting he was already on the move. "You took care of Mom exactly like she taught you. Your aunt will be there in 15 minutes. She was already in the neighborhood. Can you be brave for just a little longer?" "Yes," the boy whispered, watching as they loaded his mother into the ambulance. The neighbor was already climbing in beside her, medical bag still in hand. "Dad, I'm scared." "I know, buddy. I'm scared too," his father admitted, and somehow that honesty made the boy feel better. "But Mom's getting the help she needs now, thanks to you. We're going to get through this together, okay?" As the ambulance pulled away, sirens wailing, the boy sat on his front steps to wait for his aunt. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn, and he could see curious neighbors beginning to gather, whispering among themselves. But he barely noticed them. As the ambulance pulled away, sirens wailing, the boy sat on his front steps to wait for his aunt. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn, and he could see curious neighbors beginning to gather, whispering among themselves. But he barely noticed them. His mind kept returning to that first 911 call, the operator's dismissive tone, the crushing feeling of not being believed when it mattered most. He thought about other kids who might need help someday, who might face the same disbelief. The memory of his mother teaching him about emergency calls came flooding back. Sometimes being brave means speaking up when something's wrong, even if grown-ups don't want to listen. A police car pulled up in front of the house, and 2 officers stepped out. They approached him kindly, introducing themselves and explaining they needed to ask him some questions about what happened. As he began to tell his story again, he realized something important. This wasn't just about his mom anymore. This was about making sure every child who called 911 got the help they needed, no matter what. The officers took detailed notes as he described both calls, their expressions growing serious when he recounted the first operator's response. One of them knelt down to his level, looking him straight in the eye. "You did exactly what you were supposed to do," she said firmly. "And we're going to make sure this never happens to another child. Would you be willing to help us with that?" Before he could answer, a familiar car pulled into the driveway. His aunt had arrived. As she rushed toward him, arms already opening for a hug, the boy looked back at the officer and nodded. He would help make sure of it. Because sometimes being brave wasn't just about one moment, it was about making sure others wouldn't have to be quite so brave in the future. The hospital waiting room buzzed with quiet activity as the boy sat between his father and aunt. His dad's work boots were still dusty from the construction site, and he hadn't let go of his son's hand since arriving. The stark fluorescent lights made everything look pale and unreal, like a scene from a movie rather than his actual life. A doctor in blue scrubs approached them, her face tired but wearing a reassuring smile. "Your wife is stable," she told the boy's father. "We're preparing her for an emergency C-section. The preeclampsia is severe, and delivering the baby is the safest option for both of them right now." The boy squeezed his father's hand tighter. "Can we see her?" he asked, his voice small in the large waiting room. The doctor knelt down to his level, just like the police officer had done earlier. "Your mom is asking for you," she said gently. "We can let you see her for a few minutes before the surgery. Would you like that?" They followed the doctor through winding hospital corridors until they reached a room filled with beeping machines. His mother lay in the bed, looking pale but more alert than she had in the kitchen. When she saw them, her face lit up with a tired smile. "There's my hero," she whispered, reaching out her hand. The boy rushed to her side, carefully avoiding the tubes and wires connected to her. "The doctors told me everything. You saved both of us today, sweetheart." "I was so scared," he admitted, feeling fresh tears well up. "The first operator wouldn't listen to me." His mother's face grew serious. "I heard about that too. But you didn't give up. You found another way to get help. That's what really matters." She touched his cheek softly. "Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is keep trying when people tell us to stop." A nurse appeared in the doorway, signaling it was time. His mother squeezed his hand one last time. "Your little sister's coming a bit earlier than planned, but thanks to you, we're both going to be okay." In the waiting room, time seemed to move like honey dripping from a jar, slow and sticky. His aunt brought him snacks from the vending machine, but he could barely eat. His father paced, stopping every time someone in scrubs walked past. The boy's neighbor, who had ridden in the ambulance, sat with them too. She had changed out of her gardening clothes and now wore a sweater someone had brought her from home. Every so often, she would share stories from her nursing days, helping to pass the time and keep their minds off their worry. While they waited, 2 police officers, different from the ones who had come to the house, arrived to talk to them. They had brought something unexpected: a recording of both 911 calls. "We need to document everything properly," one officer explained, setting up a small recorder. "Would you be willing to listen and confirm these are your calls?" The boy nodded, though his stomach twisted at the thought of hearing that first operator again. His father wrapped an arm around his shoulders as the recording began to play. Hearing his own voice, small and frightened but clear, made the whole experience feel strange and distant. When the first operator's dismissive tone came through the speakers, his father's arm tightened around him. Then came the second call, with the neighbor's calm instructions and the new operator's professional response. "There's something else you should know," the officer said after the recording ended. "We've been investigating similar complaints about that first operator. Your call wasn't the only one she dismissed, but it might be the one that finally brings change." They explained that there would be a formal investigation and that they might need the boy to tell his story again, this time to people who could make sure this never happened to another child. "Would you be willing to do that?" the officer asked. "It might be a little scary, but your experience could help protect other kids who need emergency help." Before the boy could answer, a doctor appeared in the waiting room doorway. Everyone fell silent, turning toward her expectantly. "Congratulations," she said, smiling warmly. "You have a healthy baby girl, and Mom is doing well. The surgery went perfectly." The relief in the room was almost physical, like a wave washing over everyone. The boy fell into his father's embrace, both of them crying happy tears now. His aunt was already on the phone, spreading the good news to family members, while his neighbor wiped her eyes with a tissue. But even in this moment of joy, the boy was thinking about those other kids, the ones who might have been dismissed by that same operator, the ones who might still need help in the future. He turned to the police officers, who were quietly gathering their things to leave. "I want to tell my story," he said firmly. "I want to help make things better." The officers nodded solemnly. understanding the weight of his decision. One of them handed his father a card with contact information for the investigation team. "Your son," she said, "is going to help us save lives." As they headed down the hallway to meet his new sister, the boy realized something important. Being brave wasn't just about that one desperate phone call or finding another way to get help. Sometimes being brave meant using your voice to protect others who might need help someday, and even though he was just a kid, his voice was about to make a real difference in the world. 2 weeks had passed since that terrifying day in the kitchen. The boy sat in a large conference room at the emergency services headquarters, his father beside him for support. The room was filled with serious-looking people in suits and uniforms, all there to hear his story. His baby sister was home now, tiny and perfect, and his mother was recovering well. But he couldn't stop thinking about how close they'd come to a different ending. That thought gave him courage as he faced the panel of investigators. "Take your time," the lead investigator said kindly. "Just tell us everything you remember about both calls." The boy took a deep breath and started his story. He described his mother's collapse, the panic he'd felt, and how he tried to follow everything she taught him about emergency calls. His voice grew stronger as he recalled the first operator's dismissal and how it felt to not be believed. "I kept thinking about what would happen if other kids needed help," he explained, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "What if they didn't have a neighbor who was a nurse? What if they just gave up after being told they were lying?" The room was silent when he finished speaking. Then one of the panel members, an older woman with kind eyes, leaned forward. "Your call wasn't the first one this operator dismissed," she said gently. "But because you were brave enough to find another way to get help, and because you're here today telling your story, it will be the last." She opened a folder and began sharing what their investigation had uncovered. The operator had dismissed multiple calls from children over the past year, assuming they were pranks without following proper protocols. Some of these cases had resulted in delayed emergency responses, though thankfully none had ended in tragedy. "We've already made some immediate changes," another panel member explained. "Every call from a child must now be treated as genuine until proven otherwise. We're updating our training programs and adding new supervisory positions to monitor call responses." The boy's father squeezed his shoulder proudly as they listened to the changes being implemented. But then came something unexpected. "We'd like your help with something else," the lead investigator said, turning to the boy. "We're creating a new training video for all emergency operators, showing them why it's crucial to take every call seriously. Would you be willing to share your story as part of that training?" The boy thought about it. Speaking in front of all these important people had been scary enough. The idea of having his story recorded made his stomach flutter with nervousness. But then he remembered how it felt in that kitchen, watching his mother struggle to breathe while an operator dismissed his pleas for help. "Yes," he said firmly, "I want to help." Over the next few days, he worked with a small team to record his story. They filmed him in familiar settings: his kitchen, his neighbor's house, even the hospital where his sister was born. His mother, now recovering at home, participated too, explaining how she had taught him about emergency calls and sharing how his quick thinking had saved both her and the baby. The neighbor who had helped them that day also appeared in the video, speaking about the importance of taking all emergency calls seriously, regardless of the caller's age. Her years of emergency room experience lent weight to her words as she described how critical those first few minutes had been for the boy's mother. But the most powerful part was when they played the actual recordings of both 911 calls. The contrast between the first operator's dismissive response and the second operator's professionalism made a compelling case for change. "This video will be shown to every emergency operator in our state," the training coordinator explained. "And other states are already asking to use it too. Your experience is going to help train thousands of operators." As they wrapped up the final recording session, the boy's mother held her newborn daughter while talking to the camera. "My son's bravery saved 2 lives that day," she said, her voice full of emotion. "But the real impact of his courage will be felt for years to come, as his story helps ensure that every child who needs help will be heard." The team showed them a rough cut of the training video. Watching his own story played back, the boy felt strange but proud. The video ended with a powerful message: every call matters. Every voice deserves to be heard. Every moment counts. Later that evening, as his family sat together at home, his father brought out a letter that had arrived that morning. It was from the Emergency Services Department, inviting them to attend a special ceremony. They wanted to present the boy with an award for his courage and contribution to improving emergency response protocols. "You've started something important," his father said, reading the letter. "Your story is already making changes in how emergency services handle calls from kids. You've turned a scary experience into something that will help others." The boy looked at his mother, who was gently rocking his baby sister to sleep. The memory of that terrifying day in the kitchen was still fresh, but now it felt different. What had started as a desperate call for help had grown into something much bigger. A change that would protect other children and families in their moments of greatest need. "Sometimes," his mother said softly, noticing his thoughtful expression, "the bravest thing we can do is share our story, even when it's difficult. You've done that, and you've made the world a little bit safer for every child who might need help someday." Looking at his sleeping sister, the boy realized that the world she was growing up in would be different because of what had happened. Every child who called 911 would be taken seriously, their voices heard, their emergencies addressed. And that, he thought, was worth all the fear and tears and courage it had taken to get here. 6 months had passed since that life-changing day in the kitchen. The boy stood in front of his mirror, adjusting the new tie his father had bought him for the special ceremony. His baby sister, now bigger and full of smiles, watched from their mother's arms as he practiced his speech one last time. The ceremony was being held in the city's main auditorium. As his family walked through the entrance, he was surprised to see how many people had come. Emergency responders in their uniforms, city officials in suits, and families, lots of families. His neighbor was there too, no longer in her gardening clothes, but dressed elegantly for the occasion. But what caught his attention were the other children. Some of them looked about his age, others younger or older. He would learn later that they were all kids who had called 911 in the past year, some who had been dismissed, others who had gotten help. They were all here because his story had brought their experiences to light. The police chief stepped up to the podium, her voice carrying through the large room. "Today isn't just about presenting an award," she began. "It's about acknowledging that sometimes our youngest citizens can be our greatest teachers." She went on to explain how one boy's experience had sparked a complete overhaul of their emergency response system. The changes weren't just local anymore, they had spread to other cities, other states. The training video featuring his story had become mandatory viewing for emergency operators across the country. But perhaps the most important change, she continued, is in our approach to young callers. In the 6 months since we implemented our new protocols, we've seen a significant increase in successful emergency responses to calls from children. Lives have been saved because we learned to listen. The boy's former neighbor, the retired nurse who had helped save his mother, was invited to speak next. She talked about her 40 years of emergency room experience and how she had seen countless cases where minutes made the difference between life and death. What happened that day wasn't just about one family, she said, looking directly at the boy. It was about recognizing that courage doesn't have an age limit, and neither does the need to be taken seriously. Then came something unexpected. A young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, approached the podium with her parents. She told her story, how she had called 911 just last month when her grandfather had fallen and couldn't get up. "The operator asked me if I had heard about the brave boy who helped change things," she said. "She told me that because of him, they always listen to kids now. My grandpa is okay because of that." One by one, other children and their families came forward to share similar stories. Each one mentioned how the new training and protocols had made a difference in their emergency situations. The boy felt overwhelmed hearing how his experience had helped so many others. Finally, it was his turn to speak. His parents had helped him write the speech, but as he looked out at all the faces in the audience, he decided to speak from his heart instead. "I didn't feel brave that day in our kitchen," he began, his voice steady despite his nervousness. "I was just scared and trying to help my mom and my baby sister. But being brave doesn't always feel like what we see in movies. Sometimes it's just doing what needs to be done, even when you're terrified." He talked about his mother's recovery, his healthy baby sister, and the changes he had seen happen because of that day. "But the most important thing I learned," he continued, "is that kids' voices matter. We might be young, but we know when something is wrong and when someone needs help. The police chief presented him with an award, a beautiful plaque that recognized his extraordinary courage and contribution to emergency services. But what meant even more were the hugs and handshakes from other kids and their families afterward, each one with their own story of being heard when it mattered most. As the ceremony ended, the emergency services director made one final announcement. They were creating a new youth advisory board to help continue improving their response systems, and they wanted the boy to be its first member. Because sometimes, she said, the best way to serve our community is to listen to our youngest voices. Later that evening, as his family celebrated at home with a special dinner, his mother cradled his baby sister while looking at the award on their mantel. "You know," she said softly, "when I was teaching you about emergency calls, I never imagined you'd end up teaching so many others. I'm not just proud of what you did that day, I'm proud of what you've helped create." His father added, "And the best part is, this is just the beginning. The changes you helped start will keep helping people for years to come." The boy looked around at his family, his mother healthy and strong again, his baby sister growing bigger every day, his father beaming with pride, and even his neighbor who had dropped by to join their celebration. He thought about all the other families out there who would get help when they needed it most, all because one scared kid refused to give up. As he helped his mother clear the dishes after dinner, he could hear his baby sister's laughter from the living room. The sound reminded him of something important. Sometimes the scariest moments in our lives can lead to the most meaningful changes, not just for ourselves, but for others too. And that made everything they had been through worth it. That night, as he got ready for bed, he noticed a new addition to their refrigerator. A child's drawing from one of the families at the ceremony. It showed a simple stick figure using a phone, with the words "Thank you for helping them hear us" written in crayon. It was the perfect reminder that being brave isn't about being fearless. It's about making sure everyone's voice gets heard, no matter how small.